My name is George Flesh. I was born in Hungary in 1946, and my parents were both Hungarian. They both survived the Holocaust. My mother was in Auschwitz and survived. My father was in slave labor camps and escaped at a certain point in 1943 or 1944 and went to Budapest. In Budapest, he acquired Spanish protection documents, which were made by Ángel Sanz Briz, the Spanish consul in Budapest. And after he acquired these documents, at one point he was out on the street in Budapest, and German SS wanted to pick him up, and he showed them his Spanish documents and started to threaten them that if they took him away and he disappeared, the Spanish consulate would find out and there would be a big problem for the Germans. So at this point the Germans were not so confident anymore because they knew that the Russians were coming in soon from the east. So I think that if this had happened a year ago or 3 years ago in Poland, they just would have shot him on the spot and they wouldn't have thought twice about it. But at this point, the Spanish documents actually meant something. So he actually convinced the SS to call the Spanish consulate. They called the Spanish consul. The Spanish consulate sent a car. I don't know who was in that car, if it was Sanz Briz or somebody else. They took my father and they took him away to one of the Spanish safe houses in Budapest. So that's the simple story of how my father survived at some point in 1944 in Budapest. So my father died when I was 19 years old. And he never talked to me about any of his experiences during the war, during the Holocaust. So this story I heard from my mother. My mother told me the story, and I knew that it was a true story. Then, how did I find out about this, the Centro Sefarad-Israel? I saw an article in a newspaper, I think it was in the Jerusalem Post, about the Centro Sefarad-Israel is looking for descendants and people who actually received these protection documents. So I immediately sent an email to the Centro Sefarad-Israel. I got a reply very quickly. I asked for a copy of the actual list, which was sent to me. And I looked at the list, and there was my father's name. My father was number 441 on the list. And there was my father's name, the year that he was born, and the city that he was from in Hungary. So I've told my children about this. When I saw my father's name on the list, I was crying for 10 minutes. I couldn't stop. Because partly because I idolized my father. My father was a big hero to me. And partly also, it confirmed the reality of the story that my mother told me. So it made everything more real for me. But mostly, just the emotional connection with my father. And my father died, as I said, when I was 19 years old. I was relatively young. And I never heard these stories from him. So seeing his name on the list was a very emotional moment for me. And I really appreciated that this center did something to publicize the list. I never would have thought of it, really. What would my father say? So I think he would say a few things. First of all, he would express his gratitude, his appreciation for what Sanz Briz did for him. The second thing, I think he would express his gratitude to God that he survived and that He had a family, and even on top of that, he now has 4 grandchildren living in Israel. And this would mean a lot to my father. So my father had a very strong Jewish identity. And the idea that 4 of his grandchildren are now part of the reborn nation of Israel, because that's what it is. Israel is a nation that has been born again. And my father would express his gratitude. Both my father and my mother, they were engaged to other people before the war. They didn't know each other.
Really?
Yeah. Both of their fiancés were murdered. My mother's fiancé was from Slovakia, near the border of Hungary. He was deported from Slovakia and murdered in 1941, one of the first, earliest communities that was destroyed. My father was engaged, and actually he managed to legally, through some kind of, I don't know what process, he managed to marry his fiancée, but he never saw her again. And she was killed at Auschwitz. Yeah. And so the fact that I exist, it's an accident of history. A terrible accident of history. That's the truth. They met after the war in 1946. Each of them was from a small town in northeast part of Hungary, very close to each other, maybe 10 kilometers apart. And they actually met at a wedding of 2 other Jews who survived. The number of Jews who survived in these towns, approximately 10%. Between 5 and 10% of the Jews in my mother's town and my father's town survived.
After the war?
Yeah, so what happened after the war? My father and my mother, they returned to Hungary. My mother found out that some of her family had survived, so she wanted to be together with her family. My father wanted to return, not so much for family reasons. He thought that he could rebuild his business in Hungary. And they met after the war. My father did very, very well, even in a short time after the war, but he made one big mistake. He was very politically active in the Social Democratic Party, which was the biggest enemy of the Communist Party. And very soon, by late 1947, the communist newspapers were writing articles about my father, that he was a criminal and a capitalist, and they basically said that this is somebody we don't want to be in any kind of position of power. So my father realized that he had to leave, because at this time people in the Social Democratic Party, they were disappearing. The communists picked them up, killed them, never heard from them again. And my mother wanted to leave Hungary from the moment they returned from the camps. She was disgusted with the Hungarians. So in 1948, my father was able to get documents from his brother who came to the United States before the war. It was very difficult to get into the United States at that time. So my father was able to get a visa and whatever documents were necessary. And in 1948, they went to the United States. I was in Los Angeles starting at the age of 1. And I went to school there. I grew up in Los Angeles. And that was most of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Muy interesting.
Did you recognize somebody else from the list, or?
No, I did not.
Thank you for sharing with us this amazing history.